All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to White Bear Lake Area Historical Society's monthly library program. That's not at the library. We're here on Zoom where everybody can be comfortable and, not have to go out in the January cold. But at least the weather is supposed to turn warm and into the 40s in the next week or so, I guess. But I digress as usual. Hello, I'm Dan Jones, Creative Director, and I'm joined this evening with Executive Director Sarah Hansen, Allison Lincoln, our Member and Donor Services Director, and Rihanna O'Brien, our Education Director. We've got the full team here this evening. All right, so bear with me before we get started while I got some housekeeping to do. So with that said, we're going to move on a little bit. And we've got Zoom. We all may be a little rusty with Zoom, so here's a quick review. Zoom controls appear at the bottom or top of the window and may be hidden until you move your mouse or touch the screen. If you are having technical issues, your best course of action is to exit the Zoom application and reconnect to join the program again. If this does not resolve the issue, we are recording the program for future viewing. Sorry, folks, we just can't be of much help once we get the program going. Please use the Q&A box to ask questions of the presenter. That would be me, I guess, or the whole staff is here. Throughout the program, please. We will answer as many questions as time allows at the end of the program. So there you have it. All right, so I'm going to do some things before we get going. I'm going to promote some upcoming events that we've got going in just 2 days. This Wednesday, January 24th, we have trivia night at the White Bear Armory. That's literally, come on, Wednesday. Get your team together and come on down, have some fun. The escape rooms are backed by popular demand on February 23rd and 24th. That's Friday and a Saturday. Space is limited, so be sure to register your team. Our next library program will be Monday, February 26th, and also will be hosted on Zoom. It's an evening with Father John Marcoux, a pioneer for racial justice, where special guest author Matt Holland will be presenting. Matt is the author of a book that he wrote, The Rarest Kind of Courage, The Extraordinary Life of Father John Marcoux. We are partnering with Delwood Hills to host a gangster bus tour and event at Delwood Hills to include food, drink, and of course fun on Saturday, March 2nd. Again, another thing that you'd want to register early and often for that. Then coming up, a special presentation on a Thursday at 7 o'clock start time. That's a little bit different for us, so please note that. A presentation on Sophie Worth Camp on White Bear Lake. It's we've done one presentation on it before, Rihanna O'Brien. We're going to go a little bit deeper. It's one of those things where it's a little undiscovered history. I know I certainly wasn't aware of it. And of course, you can check always our website for upcoming programs, presentations, events. Just click on the event. If you need to register, all that information will be there for you at whitebearhistory.org/events. And I always got to say, and a big thank you to Ramsey County Library Program, the Legacy Amendment and Historical Society, and our Historical Society members for providing the ability to do everything that we do that includes this program. So let's get to our presentation. We are revisiting White Bear's Golden Resort era with a little twist, maybe on some different information, a few more maps as to where they were to the best of our knowledge, and maybe just a few more pictures. And for those of you who know me, know I like my maps. So, the resort era really does start to grow in 1868 when the Lake Superior Mississippi Railroad come through White Bear on its way to Duluth. In 1868, it wasn't complete through Duluth, and that wouldn't come till 1871. So it was a very, very big deal. I'm sure you can all be aware of that when White Bear was now connected from St. Paul to an international port, really the rest of the world. That is huge. That was a very big deal. And so we were lucky to have the railroad come through. And, the railroad grew from one track and it became many, many as the years went on. Here you're seeing, if you looking north of what is now Highway 61 and 4th Street, there's at least 8 to 10 tracks in there. The railroad obviously was a lifeline that helped make White Bears Minnesota's first resort community. But really, we got to go back in time a little bit, because how did we even get here? How did people even know? And that tracks back to the 1680s. Europeans obviously were becoming familiar with the area now known as Minnesota, thanks to Father Louis Hennepin, who was in this region during a mission trip in 1680 and wrote of his experience in his work, A Description of Louisiana. So he was coming up all over the place in the central part of the nation. Well, then we move forward along, and I got things out of line a little bit. Sorry about that. Then came the Louisiana Purchase, and where Minneapolis got to join the Union, because before that, I didn't get things screwed up. I'm just messing things up. Let's revert back. In 1770 and 1787, the White Bear Lake area was part of the Northwest Territory, meaning we were part of the initial United States under the Constitution. That's why I'm saying, Minneapolis wasn't part of that. They were on the other side of the river, and they belonged to France at that time. Then fast forward again, we're going to the Louisiana Purchase happens, and Lewis and Clark, we explore that, we understand all that, but you can see looking east and how vast the country has grown in such a short amount of time. I mean, think about it. 1775 is when the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. 1776, we declare independence. 1787, we have the Constitutional Convention. 1788, it gets adopted. Pretty impressive. But we're not getting explored in our area, and that's where the first expedition to map this area was in 1805, when General Zebulon Pike mapped the upper Mississippi River, paving the way for Fort Snelling, which would be about a decade later. You can see here's the Falls of St. Anthony. This is actually a huge map, and I had to turn it actually clockwise because it goes left, right. Next was Joseph Nicolet, and here we come really close. And Joseph Nicolet was hired by the U.S. government in the early 1840s. Nicolet passed through on his way to La Pointe, Wisconsin, probably more well known as Madeline Island. He was struck by the beauty of the lake and included it in his map of the hydrographic basin of the upper Mississippi River, published in 1843. That's a catchy title for people to glom onto. Nicolet used a translation of the Dakota words Mado, meaning bear, and Madey, meaning lake, to name the lake. And so you can see, I've just highlighted it. It has not been altered as far as size, but there's Bears Lake right there. We're on the map for the first time. And that was, again, 1843 was when that was published. So Euro-American people had slowly begun to take notice of the era, but after 1847, when the Surveyor General of the U.S. ordered the territory, which included White Bear Township, surveyed, and settlers began to come. And when we refer to township, I mean, we understand that township is a municipality of its own, but the original township was 6 miles by 6 miles, and you're seeing Bald Eagle Lake to the top of the map, seeing Pleasant Lake to the west of the map, and White Bear Lake, and only half of it, because the other half would be in a different county in a different township, which was known as Greenfield Township at that time. So moving on, the question is, with the railroad completed all the way to Duluth, certainly people came to live and start businesses in the area. I mean, all sorts of things were happening, from the boatworks builders and everything that was needed to support a local economy. But it really was tourism that put White Bear Lake on the map. With the ease of travel and the cooling, refreshing air compared to the large cities, White Bear Lake was a natural resort destination, and fairly close by. It still really wasn't easy to get to. Even with the railroad, you might not take that, but before the railroad, certainly not an easy place to get to. But many traveled to Minnesota to escape the sweltering heat and disease of the South. That's some pretty powerful words. In 1890, A.H. Perkins, in his publication All About White Bear Lake, goes so far as to say, and I quote, "The altitude of the lake is about 300 feet above St. Paul, thus proving a veritable revelation in its health-giving breezes. And for years it has been the mecca of the invalids and health seekers, not only of St. Paul and Minneapolis, but numbers from Chicago, Milwaukee, Kansas City, St. Louis, New Orleans, and many southern cities. Those who have spent a season here come again year after year, and they see them mingling in pleasures and recreation. This is quite the interesting, I would say, book. It is a paperback, probably more so advertising as much as information, but it gave information on the businesses, on the churches, on the community, on houses, wealthy citizens that were built. Interesting read. Of course, you've got to keep an eye of who's writing it and for what purposes. But we can't, and we can't forget the wealthy business folks that of St. Paul and surrounding areas and their families who made their summer homes at White Bear. White Bear was to St. Paul like Minnetonka was to Minneapolis, but the 1870s summer cottages sprang up along Lake Avenue and other places and just all around the lake. And yes, our own Philip Brown house, built in 1879, was one of those cottages. But the main thing that drew people to White Bear Lake was rest, relaxation, and fun. So fishing and renting a rowboat, sailing, all those things were happening in a very large degree, especially with sailing. Sailing became a large part of our community. Here's your rowboating and happening going there, swimming. It wouldn't be going to the lake if you're not going to swim. Love those pictures. Family gatherings. This is one of my favorite gatherings. I'm sure Sarah will not be happy with me on showing this picture, but it's a time. And people they just didn't stay at the resort. Notice the tent in the background. This was very common for people to pitch a tent and have a good time. They might not be staying at the golden resorts, especially with large family groups out here. Word has it, Sarah will correct me later, I'm sure, but even on Clark Avenue, people pitched tents and they stayed for a while, to the point of bringing appliances, pictures, hanging them inside the tent walls. It was a summer deal, and I guess you can understand that with travel. And of course, one of the biggest draws for almost 30 years was Wildwood Amusement Park. Just a great, it was part of a lot of things going on that made that, but yeah, we're going to kind of include it in the resort area because people were drawn to the area for that. All right, moving on. So how do we get to, we know now how people got up here, but most people needed a place to stay, and that started in the commercial Bay Area of White Bear Lake. Amongst the earliest was Villeroy Barnum and his family. Yeah, they were from the eastern United States, as many of the Minnesota settlers were. Barnum purchased the land between Goose and White Bear Lakes. On this site, he built a bark-covered tamarack cabin that he enlarged, and by 1853, 1854, opened up the first hotel, resort, whatever you want to call it, in the territory. This is probably later on, but it's one of the most rustic shots that we've gotten. There's not a lot of pictures of what's about to take place, but some accounts depict Barnum as a very reluctant hotel keeper. Modest compared to those who would soon be built, the hotel was known as the Barnum House. In 1857, it was sold to John Lamb for $4,000, a considerable sum of money. And keep in mind, this property was significantly large. It's basically encompasses most of the property that White Bear Shopping Center sits on. So John Lamb then sold to William Lipe in 1866 for the sum of $2,500. Lipe must have been quite the deal maker because, wow, he just paid $1,500 less. Lipe emigrated from Germany in 1846 and was running a prosperous liquor and cigar trade in St. Paul within a decade. By 1861, he had taken up brewing ale. Well, who wouldn't, honestly? Looking again for a change, Lipe sold his stake in the ale business in 1865 to purchase the Barnum House. Odds are he was known as Colonel Lipe. To be honest, I have never been able to attribute what that comes from, whether it came from Germany or just a show of respect for the man. But what was interesting, the guy obviously knew how to speculate real estate. The key date in that is that he purchased the properties in 1865. Pretty obvious that the railroad was going to be coming up, and we knew the route. And again, that was in 1868 when it came through. So Mr. or Colonel Lipe immediately began making improvements by setting shade trees and building a 30 by 50-foot addition to the south of the building. So here you're seeing the front porch. This is the area that faces the lake. But it was set back based on buildings from maps that we've seen. It was set back considerably from the lake. Probably, maybe not as far as the shopping center is today, but pretty close. Lipe was quite the promoter, offering a variety of services, including a ballroom, bowling alleys, a billiard room, a villa, and a sample room, better known as a bar. So here's some characters hanging out at the Lipe House Resort and Hotel. Within the first 5 years of Lipe's management, the hotel went from 10 rooms to 103, able to accommodate up to 300 people. The resort business was booming, and Lipe was set square in the middle. Obviously, his investment paid off. In July of 1881, the American Traveler's Journal reported that landlord Lipe fed over 800 persons at dinner and supper, and he has 258 permanent boarders. I don't know what permanent boarders mean, but man, if they're staying year-round, good for them. Over the next 15 years, Lipe made many additions and improvements that eventually accumulated in a hotel featuring the dining room that was about 40 by 100 feet, 2 5-room cottages with a pavilion along the lakeshore. In 1890, the rates were $2 or $2.50, depending on the location of the room. By the end of the 1896 season, the hotel was totally destroyed by fire. The glory of the Lipe House era had come to a pretty quick end. William Lipe went on and died. How about that for being respectful? William Lipe died in 1908, and he is buried beneath a pine tree at St. John in the Wilderness Cemetery at the corner of South Shore Boulevard and White Bear Avenue. That's kind of cool. Well, the Lipes weren't completely done with the property. Lipe's wife, Agnes, would continue to own the property until 1912, 1913. Varying dates on that. She passed away in 1913, but it appears that the property was sold before that. All right, so that's pretty much the cottage park, and you can see here is a 1908 map with her names on it as that property. So here you've got Cottage Park right in the middle, and that triangular area is Lipe's Resort. The lake to the southeast is, or southwest is Goose, and northeast is White Bear. The next area for large resorts was really along Lake Avenue, and it was a great spot to be because it was only a 2-block walk from the railroad depot in downtown White Bear Lake. So it was close and convenient. This walk would take you to the second known this walk would take you to the large White Bear Resort known as the Williams House. And this is a 1916 plat map you're looking at, and they still highlighted the hotels and or resorts and or house. So the property included the old Murray House, which is historic, built by J.C. Murray. And the property was located just at the intersection of Lake Avenue and 2nd Street, a little bit in. You can see the star. So you can see Stewart coming in at the bottom, Lake Avenue going southwest to the left of the aerial shot. F.C. Williams then purchased the property from Dr. J.H. Stewart in 1870, and it didn't take long for Williams to build an addition of 40 by 36 feet onto it and start expanding the House of Williams, I guess. By 1881, 5 cottages and a 35-foot pavilion were added. The main house and cottages could now accommodate 200 guests. Again, that's a lot of people. You got 300 down at the Lipes. You've got 200 people up here. you can see what that would do to the local economy and why the trades grew like they did. You can see, these always crack me up, these illustrations. You can see the growth of the Williams house, at least based on the illustration advertisement. Keep in mind, this is an advertisement. And we have to remember that's marketing and may have been embellished just a bit. But it's representing some of the things that were there. It certainly looks like the house from the photo. But who knows about the office and how big the gazebo was. But that's okay. They're trying to drag people in, they're trying to get people here. But it's interesting to read the advertisement they had for the Williams house. Invalids and pleasure seekers in search of health or enjoyment will find here all the appliances needed for both, together with every desirable home comfort, a quiet house, pleasant grounds, pure air, delightful drives, shady walks, cheerful society, and an excellent table and service. One of my favorite things is the lower sentence where they're talking about billiard tables, they have billiard tables, bowling alleys, boarding stables. Again, people were still riding horses, a good dairy, but the best one, the best men cooks. Don't know what that means, but it was just kind of funny and struck me odd for that. All right. So you can see that this is one of those stereo graphs that you put into the lenses on your face, and you see one with a little bit of 3D action. But there's a lot of people hanging out in front of the Williams house. I'm sure, I doubt it was all of their fleet, although it says fleet at Williams house. But this is what folks were doing. They were hanging out in boats, whether they were fishing, rowing, just out there for pleasure. And then, of course, you've got the sailboats, the ever-present sailboats that were going around there. So basically, right across the street, 2nd Street from the Williams house was Hotel Chateauguay, which was originally known as the Benson House. And yes, it is the same Benson family connected to the Bald Eagle area. In 1884, Frederick W. Benson sold the property to William F. Marcoux, and that would be Sarah Hanson's great-great-uncle, for a sum of $20,000. That's a lot. I mean, okay, so, think what Colonel Light paid for that, what his piece of property, and now you've got Mr. William F. Marcoux dropping $20,000. That's a lot of money and significantly more, and maybe it is something like, location, location, location. One of the great stories that comes out of here was that immediately after the purchase in May, Marcoux installed the first telephone in the village of White Bear Lake for the sum of $55. The phone was installed in the dining room of the hotel. Unbelievable. Seriously, unbelievable that we have a receipt, and I'm sure that is thanks and credit going to the Marcoux family for getting this and having it, sharing it. The guest rooms ran around the large dining room, and a $4,000 wing was added to the Chateauguay in 1885. An account in the Pioneer Press quotes Marcoux as saying, "These were the boom days at the lake, when advertising and yellow fever in the South brought thousands of tourists and refugees to Minnesota summer resorts. Scores of guests were glad to pay for the privilege of sleeping on the billiard table or on cots in the corridors." Well, I'm sure that would make today's fire standard folks really happy. But you know what? You got to make a buck when you can make a buck. I believe this is, if not the only one, this is the only photo of the Chateauguay. Great picture. Just look at the center of the building going up over the trees. Even if it's the only one, which I believe it is, still a great picture. All right. Well, fires seemed to plague everyone, and Chateauguay was just like everybody else in the early resorts. During one fire in the late 1880s, a wing of the structure was damaged in spite of creative efforts from the fire department, including the report that young boys were tied to ropes and lifted onto the roof to pour water on the flames. Yeah, wow, okay. By this time, Marcoux had sold the hotel back to Frederick W. Benson, who again continued to run it for many years. And what was again interesting is having this handwritten note. And I don't know if Sarah can jump in on right now, but the note is obviously written from a family member, because it goes on to state, because dear Papa, Benson's preposition is simply this: he will take back the place with all of the, then it's cut off. So here's Benson, someone from Benson's family, basically negotiating, saying, yeah, we're interested in buying it back from the Marcoux. So that's just interesting to have. All right, thank you. I was just informed Sarah's no longer with us. Sorry, my computer's being fun tonight, so I can't see anything that's going on except exactly what you're looking at, only just my screen. So there. All right, so Benson bought it back. It changed names several times, and when it finally, big shocker, succumbed to fire in 1910, it was known as the Oriental Hotel. So these resort hotels just weren't on the west side of the lake. One or more, they were dotted throughout the entire lake, but one of the more well-known ones on the east side was over in Mahtomedi. And that was the Mahtomedi Hotel. That was located at the foot of Quail Street in Mahtomedi, near what is now Chautauqua Park and or beach. So great structure, beautiful building. And this one, I know we only have one photo seeing coming up. The building does no longer stand, but in its original form, but a portion of it remains part of a private residence today that sits overlooking the park and beach. This picture was taken in 2020 when the road was being reconstructed. So what's interesting about the park across the street, which is called Chautauqua, and here we had a little drone going on, so we were able to look back and to see this natural amphitheater that developed. And the house that we're talking about, you can see the brown one on the right, you can see the gray one at the top, and to the far left, that is the original location of the Mahtomedi Hotel. But this amphitheater beach area was also used by the Chautauqua Assembly, a religious group that came out of Chautauqua, New York. So the folks from Chautauqua built a large assembly hall, and they used the beach area for outdoor meetings when the weather was too hot to be inside the building. Now, keep in mind, the building, it's very sad that this building doesn't exist. And if you were down at the Mahtomedi District Center, so if you went a little bit north, you'll see a pond, and I believe it's called Hamlin Pond. I can't remember, to be honest, and I apologize for that. But that's where this building was located. And you can see it had grass floor, dirt floor. It was basically more than a barn than anything else. But it was used, obviously, when the weather was inclement or cool enough to be inside. The Chautauqua Assembly was kind of like the old-time Christian revivals of the big tents that are, but they obviously had a permanent location. And many guests came to speak. Thanks to Rhianna O'Brien's research, by the way, one of the guests that's probably the most confirmed and documented, well-known, was William Jennings O'Brien, Rhianna O'Brien, thanks. William Jennings Bryan. And obviously, you probably don't know who he is or don't remember, but Jennings was a three-time loser Democratic presidential nominee. And I say loser, kind of, not really. I mean, the guy had the party ticket for the Democrat Party 3 different times, was not able to win the elections in the late 1890s and the early part of the 20th century. He later went on to serve as Secretary of State to President Woodrow Wilson. Again, say that a couple times fast. Here's our actual photograph of the Mahtomedi Hotel. And this is, I'm going to flip back because you look at look at that illustration. And again, a lot of the illustrations tend to exaggerate or embellish greatly. So here's the illustration, and the photo is not a good photo, but it's actually, in my opinion, very close and representative of what the actual building was. And again, that was unusual. So one of the things about the Chautauqua Assembly aspect was they basically shared, well, they didn't share the land, but the Matamidi Hotel and the Chautauqua Assembly, certainly their land touched and was adjacent to each other, and they both took advantage of Chautauqua Park and Beach and that natural amphitheater. One minor thing here, it was rumored that Mark Twain once spoke here, but there is no proof, no documentation, nothing to that whatsoever. So if you hear anybody say that, snuff it out. Not true. Not true. Most likely, many of the Chautauqua Assembly members or people that came in for the church group, most likely many stayed at the Matamidi Hotel. So that's kind of cool. There are also a lot of smaller resorts. I mean, a lot. And so some of them just aren't as well known, or they didn't advertise in the White Bear Press or the local area, other type of advertisements. But they also just weren't on the lake. The Lakeside Cottage near 7th Street and Lake Avenue, that was actually on the lake, and it was just north of Mataska Park, and they could accommodate about 20 guests. So they kind of turned into boarding houses during the season. Other smaller hotels were in business in and around town. The Cobb House was very well known, first and foremost, as a very wealthy family that built a beautiful home. Well, somehow that single family home grew into the Cobb House, which became a resort, a hotel of sorts. And you know what? The Cobb hopefully they're known more for their $1 chicken dinners, which again, maybe a good price, and chicken wasn't the easiest thing to find, believe it or not, at that time. So the home still exists on the corner of Banning Avenue and First Street. Beautiful home. Great, awesome that it's still preserved. Another enterprise was the White Bear House across from the railroad station in town. As early as 1876, it could accommodate 35 guests and was located at the corner of Washington Square, or what was really Railroad Avenue and 4th Street, where the Lake Country Bookseller stands today. It's fitting that this particular site is the home of the booksellers because it was also the site of the community's first public reading room. So the hotel is facing directly west, so it does face Washington Square. So you see the two gentlemen off to the left, they could step off the curb and go into 4th Street on that. But it's the hotel, the White Bear House, not only it goes back and it goes back around. As a matter of fact, currently, where the restaurant is adjacent to booksellers, the hotel, the building does wrap around that. So it's just interesting. And I don't know how 35 people could sleep in there, but again, maybe they're on cots in the hotel, whatever they need to do to rent the room. All right, moving on. Another one, again, chicken dinner, a specialty, was the Lakeshore Inn. And it was appropriately located near Lakeshore Station, which was just across from basically where the VFW sits today. It was built and operated by E.L. Dunn. The property was originally part of the Villeroy Barnum's land holdings. Again, go back to Mr. Barnum. So we're all the way down to Highway 61, basically where the bank sits at the corner of White Bear Avenue and Highway 61, and you're going all the way up. It is a huge chunk of property, huge chunk of property. But guess what happened to it in 1880? One guess. Yep, you're right. It burned down. So moving on, there was also another one was the Good Willie Cottage between 2nd and 3rd Streets on Cook Avenue. As you can see, they boasted lunches to orders at all hours and reasonable rates. Again, in the summertime, I think these smaller locations probably slept 10 to 15 at the most, but they were boarding houses more so than resorts. But people wanted to come into the area. Especially, this is where did people stay when they wanted to go over to Wildwood Park? Because Wildwood Park was not open past X amount of time. I mean, their time closings varied, but when they closed, they closed. So you were kind of stuck out there. The streetcar was there in the 1890s, and once that last streetcar left, or the last steamer left, you were stranded. So people would come out and stay a night at these locations because maybe they wanted to stay 2 days at Wildwood Park. There was a lot to do at that time, a lot to do. But those are the smaller ones that dotted around. But then we come to the big granddaddy of them all, which started out very small. The Romali's Pavilion was known as the grandest of all resorts on the lake. It began in 1879 as a very small refreshment pavilion that also rented boats. So where you're looking at is basically the VFW right now. That is, you're looking towards the lake, so you'd have Cottage Park to the right. But that didn't last long, and it was rebuilt by the spring of 1890 at the cost of $75,000 for construction and furnishings, and opened as the Romali Pavilion. Now, this is stretching all the way up to the office buildings, the lawyer building, encompassing the VFW building itself, and also Veterans Park in between there. That's where this is. And they had a good location, but it was a huge, huge building. Love this picture: carriage, horses, train tracks. Again, probably putting this in a time at 1890 or so, before cars, before there was a Highway 61. It had an auditorium that could seat 2,000 people. Now, the quote says in grand style. Okay, so I think we could all make a quick head count here of what would be grand style, but I don't think that's it. But it was a large thing going on, and you can see they had balconies go in here. I mean, this is a huge room in a huge building. But I don't know if you could, maybe you could stand 2,000 people in there. And, looking at what's on stage, what you're seeing is a pickle, a flag or a banner with a pickle on it, known as the Pickle Club. And we still don't know what was going on with the Pickle Club. We've got, I know of at least one other picture where here's this pickle and it says Pickle Club on the banner and displays, but we don't know what it is. But pretty impressive nonetheless. Here's the front and what they had going on. The pavilion located between the Lakeshore Station, and that's what you're looking at on the left. You can see shore, the photo cut off the lake part. So it had access to, on the east side via the railroad, or what would be Highway 61, and by the streetcar would come through there eventually also, stemming off from Wildwood Park. The streetcar came around the lake, went into downtown, and then went back. The streetcar did not go to St. Paul via White Bear Lake. Streetcar went to Wildwood, then to North St. Paul, then back to St. Paul. But look at that building. I mean, it's just, it's amazing. And I will say this, I find it kind of ironic that people were saying, well, how could we ever build those big buildings on the lake? Well, they did. The pavilion also had access to the lake. Obviously, it was basically built on the lake, and the steamers would come in and pull up and go back and forth to wherever points. The big ones, the small ones. Here you've got the steamer White Bear and the Wildwood were the two very big steamers that could hold up to 300 people. They were double deckers. Rumored that Romali, and we'll talk about the boatworks briefly, the Romali family built one of those. Because they had a boatworks going on. So access to both sides of the lake. That was pretty cool. Here's just another image looking at the building. Very cool. Again, looking northeast. So basically, maybe you've got tallies going on to the end of the building is where that would be. Building certainly stood out from the shore, and you could easily see it across the lake. Easily see it. Just a big, big building. And here it's just so cool to see the sailboats, rowboats, which, by the way, many of those boats were built by the boat builders along Commercial Bay, and this is where Romele Pavilion is at. And I'm looking at those rowboats to the far right of that picture. I mean, think of it. It's 1890. How do you get that rowboat home? That rowboat is not light. It is not small. Can you get it on a wagon? I don't know, but that was a bread and butter of the boatwork builders, was building those rowboats. So then they had the Romele Boat Company, and this is at the far, far south. Basically, it's marsh now. Not on the Lions Park property, but continued to go around towards Cottage Park. I mean, it was at the very, very end of that. So they were a very large boat builder located on that site. Again, building rowboats, sailboats. They even built steamers. And the remnants of this building would go on to become the Plantation Nightclub in about 30 years. That's a different story, though. So what's little known, and you probably realize it now, the Romeles were into everything, doing the pavilion, doing boat works. They were also selling real estate. So directly across from where the pavilion was the Romele development. They sold houses, only $50 to secure a beautiful home. So this is in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it was really the first. I'll say it loosely, but it was a suburban area, right directly across from where Lincoln Avenue and Romele Park. That's why it's named after, for the family that literally developed the area. So coming kind of full circle back to this now, we get back to the area of Goose and White Bear Lake, and we better known as White Bear Shopping Center. And so what you're seeing here is this is probably a late 1950s picture. And this big triangular piece, you got Goose Lake at the bottom. This is probably 30s. My guesstimate is that Goose Lake is dry at this point. I do not believe there's any water in that. And we do have pictures of Goose Lake where it's dry. So you got Old White Bear Avenue coming, that is now South Lake Avenue coming along. And that's the Johnson Boat Works and the expansions that they had at the top of the triangle. And then you've got this area right here. And what is happening? That's basically White Bear Shopping Center, better known as basically everybody, just Kowalski's. But Agnes, getting back to Agnes Light, she died in 1913, but she sold off the property to the St. Paul Automobile Association, who built a clubhouse there the following year. So they built the Automobile Association, 1913. You can see the building. It's not a great picture, but there it is with access off 61 and around the property back to Goose Lake. And there it is, a nice postcard of the St. Paul Auto Club. Beautiful colored picture. I'm sure it was black and white. I know it was before it got there. I do find it odd that the club, quote unquote club, was used because it was an extensive estate. You just saw the overhead of that. It was big. I mean, look at the bill. It was multiple buildings going on here. To call it a clubhouse, that's a little bit small, I think, and maybe that's what they wanted. But it was the place where people came, and it was on 61. And if you know, Highway 61 was beginning to come through there. So they were picking the right location, because by the mid 1920s, the railroad area, the road became US 61 that connected all the way up to Grand Marais and went all the way down to New Orleans. It was one of the first freeways, US 61. And so they were at a point where, the people in cars, they were dusty, they were bumpy, flat tires all day long. And so they built these types of facilities. Call it a rest stop that you had to join and become a member to be able to stop at. So the Automobile Association eventually became an apartment complex. It got run down during the 50s and was torn down in the mid 50s. Approximately, the land was cleared, but basically when they tore it down, White Bear Shopping Center was built along with the new White Bear Avenue, the 4 lanes coming around the lake. That happened all at roughly around the late 1950s, early 60s. So at the end of the day, Automobile Association replacing all of our resorts. This is Automobile Association is a form of a resort. It's tourism, but it's a different type. It's cars. And that basically signaled the end of an era. The car was here to stay. Roads were being built along with more railroad connections to the northern part of the state, that there was just more places to go. There was more places to go build a cottage. And, this actually is taken, this is a picture that is taken right across the street. This is on 4th Street. And it's in the empty parking lot of the, well, I can't think of it now, between the dentist and Abbott. Thank you. Abbott, it's Abbott's parking lot where this building was. And it was the authorized Ford dealer. So it was owned by Al Podvin after 1925, and that would be Al Podvin as in Podvin Park. So little history on that. But the car was here to stay. And this era led into World War I, which was a pause on everything, and then into the Roaring 20s. And that is another time and another story to tell for the White Bear area. So with that, Rihanna, I am done. So how about that? And by the way, Rihanna was texting me the time to see, what I was doing. So at this point, if we have questions, I'm going to beg off and quit.
No, you could just stick around for a little bit here.
Yeah, no, I'm sticking. I don't know what to do with my screen.
Nope, this is perfect. Actually, this is the first time I've actually had a call in question response.
Wow.
And this is from Jan Holtz. So I was on the phone for
Of course. Jan Holtz. I know why she's calling, I bet.
What do you think it's about?
It's about the Cobb House.
Absolutely, it is. You hit the nail right on the head. And she was talking about how her father bought it in the early 50s for $10,000. But
wow,
amazing. She said it needed a lot of work. But J. Lee Cobb, who also owned the lumber yard that burned down eventually, right?
Same time period, Rihanna?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or around that time period.
Yeah.
But he actually chose to build his house out of brick instead of lumber because he knew that it would last longer, which of course he was 110% accurate in that. So,
well, let me make a comment on that. Surely fires were a problem. Everything was built out of wood. We all understand that. Fire departments really did not modernize until the late 1920s, folks. Horse-drawn steam pumpers were not an uncommon thing to see even through the 20s, especially in smaller towns, especially in towns that weren't funding their fire department.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, fires, even with the lake there, but it certainly was a coincidence, Rihanna, don't you think?
I would say there's definitely some coincidence there.
There was a lot of fires that happened at very timely. Oh, Colonel Leap dies. Well, we must replace the fire.
Funny how that works. And by the way, I am still chuckling about, William Jennings O'Brien. So that's but pretty incredible. So the other question we had was about the Romali Pavilion. And I think I can answer some of it. There was questions about where it was located. And from my understanding, it was right by Veterans Memorial Park. And then around that area.
Literally, okay, so go from the VFW, encompass all of that building, through Veterans Park, all the way to like some of the buildings. They used to be the flats apartments, and then they got developed into office and or houses. I think it's the Lawyer Building. That's where that was.
Yeah. Okay.
Right there. And it was right on the lakeshore.
That's a great way to describe it too. It's kind of hard to imagine these giant buildings that were all lining the shore. I know when I go into classrooms and have these conversations with students, it's really hard for them to imagine that this all used to be resort era. Of course, their main focus is, by the way, third grade is starting a petition to bring back Wild Meadow Amusement Park. So,
Oh,
you know, that's
great.
definitely a thing.
Be a small scale.
Definitely small scale. I'm still waiting for more questions to come in. Again, this is like we have a ton of research in this area too. So even if you think about something later on and you want to shoot us an email, White Bear History at office at whitebearhistory.org. Feel free to email us. Also, our social media accounts, if you want to even look up more about the Pickle Club, we have posts on the Pickle Club and more pictures. And our website also has a lot of avenues to do some of your own personal research too.
That's it. Was I
Oh, wait,
can't
I
believe
just had, wait, hold on. Were there small mom and pop resorts with individual cabins? I know there was some around Bald Eagle.
yes. Not around there. There was probably in Matamidi, probably in Bald Eagle, not really around the Eastern or like Delwood wasn't developed for a long time, just FYI. Yeah, the yacht club and a couple of larger houses went out there. But yes, mom and pops, you could describe them all, and I'm not being sarcastic to the question, but there was Spring Park Villa, there was a lot of smaller that were still family owned and run. So,
Um, Absolutely.
single, yeah, so that's a hard thing to define.
Well, I mean, you could even consider the Phil Brown house as one of those sites because she
Well,
rented out and whatnot too.
right. I mean, it was rented out. People did what I mean, so this era kind of went into these large homes being built with these extra buildings that are adjacent to the property or to that building.
Hmm.
It kind of obviously things weren't regulated like they are today. So you went into the 20s, which was a booming area. Then you go into the Depression, and everybody is trying to make a buck or survive. So if you could sublet something, so yeah, I wouldn't call that the golden era of resorts, but it is, and I'm sure that was happening anywhere in the country.
Absolutely. So I have another question from Deb. What was the far right distance of the Ramaley Resort along the lake? Is that
So
going to Cottage
Deb,
Park?
if I'm understanding her question, she's facing the lake.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the far right. The guesstimate is it just went beyond the existing VFW building. We don't know exactly how far.
Okay. There was a large structure in the slide. I'm assuming she's talking about the big toboggan slide that was on the lake,
Yes,
also known as Hooligans Slide, that we
okay,
have reference of the governor in the early
right
1900s.
here.
Yep. We have
Yeah.
a reference to the governor in a newspaper going down in the early 1900s. And basically, the newspaper was giving him a hard time because they could hear him screaming halfway across the lake. So,
Oh, I mean, but this is one of my favorite.
Hooligan Slide. Um,
Hooligan slide.
Hooligan Slide. I have a newspaper article on it. So did the building on the VFW site burn down?
Yes, yes, it
Yes.
did.
Which
The Ramaley Pavilion burned down. Yes, and it was open only 18 years. I mean, that's a significant investment for only 18 years.
absolutely. Okay, what about the cabins by 60 what about the cabins by Cabin 61 that are still there?
Okay, great
I
question. That was brought about. I got to rack my brain. We did a presentation, and what's in a name? Um, so that was I can't remember what it was called, but it was those cabins were built on the south side, and the same owner, Bill something. His daughters, if you live in the neighborhood of Sharon and that neighborhood, he's got a couple kids named after him because he developed that. Um, anyways, that was a little resort that was built in the late 1930s, so it's not part of the Golden Resort era. But those were little cabins that you could rent, and there's some great pictures that we have of when the tornado came through in 41 and tossed them around like dice on
Oh, those are some crazy. Yeah,
Yep. And
absolutely.
just FYI, that same person, and I wish I could remember his name, they owned a restaurant along Washington Square uh that was a diner type restaurant. And he also owned the property that was what is now White Bear Country Inn. He had a night the White Bear Motel that was on the north side. So he had a nicer version coming up in a nice modern hotel on the north end on 61. And then he had it on the south side. And that south side, by the way, was built when Highway 61 still followed Hoffman Road. There was no, like, Goose Lake, folks, used to be one lake. It had an island. And when they rebuilt Highway 61 in the 50s, they literally made an isthmus and divided the lake into two. It is still connected by pipes going underneath, but yeah.
Okay, so I've got some comments off to the side by Meg Todd and of course and the Lindbecks, who we know that they're great with this. So that was the Jansons.
Bill
There
Jansen.
we go.
Yes.
They're
Yes,
helping us
yes.
out here. Thank you for that, both of
Thank
you.
you.
So
I so wanted to go and pull up that PowerPoint.
it's a lot of info. It's a lot of info. So I've got an anonymous person asking if we know of anyone of note who would come to visit White Bear Lake. Here's the deal. We had F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife visiting for sure. I mean, musicians that were coming in too were pretty amazing. We had anything from Fats Waller to some of the premier musicians, even coming in through New York at the time, playing at the Plantation
Guy
nightclub.
Lombardo and his Royal Canadian.
And even so, we've just started to hit the tip of the iceberg as far as like the Chautauqua were concerned, because you had some of the premier orators of the time in the late 1800s and early 1900s coming in here during that progressive movement. And they were the first women lawyers. They were the first Black orators of the area coming into Mahtomedi and having those conversations. Again, that could be another whole program in itself. And it's fabulous to go through all those newspapers and research. So,
Well,
did I
and
miss anybody in there?
just to leave a key on that, I mean, I kind of made fun of Williams, Jennings, Bryan. But that would be, politics aside, folks, but that would be like an Al Gore running once, twice, three times, getting the nomination three different times to be the Democratic presidential nominee.
And not even to mention the fact that if you've ever watched Inherit the Wind, and we've got the Scopes trials coming through, he was
Yeah.
a figurehead in that.
Huge public national figure.
Amazing,
Huge.
amazing.
So to
God,
have someone, I mean, he was on a presidential scale. And by the way, as Secretary of State, that was, a big, big position, much bigger than it is today as far as what it gets credit for, I guess.
absolutely.
Federal system.
I've got any events, festivals, or traditions that would happen during this era that you would know of. Tons.
One of the things that I didn't go into was the entertainment factor for the resorts. The resorts would pull together, including Lipes and Rameli's and some, the bigger ones, and they would pay the steamers to pull a barge with an orchestra on it, and they would play in the nice summertime evenings, and they would go up and down on the lakeshore on the east side of the lake. I'm assuming, let's say Chateauguay is the largest resort that was going north, and then Lipes being on the south side being large. I'm assuming they would go back and forth between them. But as far as festivals, I am not aware of anything outside of the normal. Obviously, Veterans Day was a big deal. Memorial Day, big deal.
St. Paul Winter Carnival. I mean, you've got the Colonel, who we have record of basically not only helping harvest the ice from White Bear Lake to build these giant ice castles in St. Paul, but he dressed up all of his horses, and then it leaves record of him sleeping next to the ice so nobody messed with it before, before he built these ice castles.
A dedicated guy.
Yeah, I mean the horses and the plumes and the whole thing, it was hilarious. But yeah, very much in those aspects, I guess you could say festivals for sure. Next one. Gosh, these are some fantastic questions. Were there any resorts on Manitou Island?
Okay, very good question on that. Manitou Island, literally from the time people could walk on it or wade the before it was a bridge, was a private piece of land that went undeveloped for a long time. And then in about 1880, an association bought it. And for example, the original builder of the Philibrown house, Noyce, right?
The Noyce family.
The Noyce family, they built the Philibrown, lived there 2 years. An opportunity came to build on Manitou Island, and they took it. Originally, there was 30 lots, and they were private. So really, nothing has changed. Now, what gets a little bit where we look at, they built a clubhouse. So back in the day, they built these large houses. They didn't really want, and they didn't want to do the kitchens because again, kitchens were a fire hazard.
And heated up your
Yeah, and
establishment.
heated up your house. So they built a clubhouse in the center that was for entertainment, communal dining, whatnot. So there was a very large clubhouse that, guess what, also burned down in the late 1890s, but not before Cass Gilbert and his mother rented it for a summer while Mr. Gilbert, a famous architect of the state capitol and our own little White Bear Town Hall, and many, many,
And
many.
how easily we forget about Cass Gilbert, even though he had such a huge impact in our area,
Yep.
because we talk about him all the time, but we're like, we always think he's famous, right?
There's a great picture of Cass Gilbert's mother
Unbelievable.
sitting in the middle of the great room of the Manitou Island clubhouse, let's call it. And she's got a flag that's got like an odd number of stars. So of course I'm going to count the stars. The number of stars correlates to when Utah became a state, but she's sitting there knitting in a rocking chair. Anyways, but that's what it was. Also, if case anybody gets reminded, down at Cottage Park, same thing happening down at Cottage Park, and there was a very large communal building, very similar in design to the Manitou Island one. It went on to become many things, including a hospital, a sanatorium, and actually a piece of that building still is attached to an existing house that's down in Cottage Park today.
Okay. Awesome. Deb's asking another question about what the building was behind the slide, and I'm fairly certain that building was the bathhouses.
Okay, was it the, so
So if you can see off to the far right.
It's right behind the slide.
Yeah.
My guess, if I'm doing my dates right, that could be the Prano house.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm seeing the pitch of the roof. I know that next I have opposite side pictures where it's the bathhouses that are
That's
lined.
yes, it dead to the center is definitely, it's got to be bathhouse, boathouse, whatever house.
And
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
Great. That makes sense. All right. So did Mark Twain visit White Bear Lake, or did he just write about the legend? You talked a little bit about this, Dan. And here's the deal. Like, I've done extensive research going through all of the old newspapers that have been uploaded and whatnot. I find a random reference in Winona that said that Mark Twain had gone through White Bear Lake, but again, no concrete proof that he was, other than the fact that he might have, and this is what I've heard, other than he might have gotten stuck on a train in the middle of the night somewhere in White Bear. And to be honest with you, he wasn't really complimentary of our White Bear legend and whatnot when you're looking through that book.
He was right. Let's be honest. Terrible legend, but
the 16 million versions of it that we have.
Not everybody has a legend either, so that's it's always a silver lining. Yes, that to my understanding, and this one was so when back in 2020, I was doing doing a video on a tour around the lake, back in COVID times, and so we got to the island and we got to the legend of because Spirit Island, that's kind of the legend comes out of that island of Manitou Island.
Yep.
And Sarah Hansen, our executive director and boss and mentor and everything else. If there's going to be anybody that knows anything or has uncovered anything, it's going to be her. And what Rihanna just said about maybe Twain was coming through on his way to somewhere else, and that it was my recollection of what Sarah said, it could have been that the story was exactly got stuck middle of the night, was here for a pause. Somebody from White Bear Lake decided to tell Mr. Twain about the legend. So that is the folklore that whether he ever came through, we don't know.
And that's what we have with history too, though, is that the more information that we find and that gets uncovered, sometimes these stories can change, right? Like Mark Twain was actually actively involved with the Chautauqua, so it would make sense that he might have been here, but yet we can't prove that yet either. So
Yeah. So I mean, this is where, this is what makes White Bear unique, is these folklore stories. We just got to know what the difference is between yes, it did happen, or no, it did happen, or maybe. And a maybe that's part of history. It's just you got to make sure you put the asterisk behind it that it's a maybe.
and I can
And with Mark Twain, I mean, what isn't a maybe is that Mark Twain wrote in one of his novels, possibly, arguably, one of the greatest, most well-selling novelists at the latter part of the 18th century. And he wrote about White Bear Lake. So this is where I'm like, good press is bad press, or bad press is
right.
good press, right? How many towns can say that Mark Twain wrote in a book about them? So,
And F. Scott.
and F. Scott, yeah.
I mean, that's pretty incredible. So I think that's the end of our questions. But you know what, Dan? I'm starting to think we should do a podcast together.
We should. This is awesome.
This is a lot of fun. We appreciate all of you for coming on tonight, and sharing this history with us. So,
All right, folks, have a good evening. Thanks for bearing with me and dealing with me, and we will see you next time.
take care, everyone.